Chapter 1. Riding old Red bareback with the wind blowing in my hair, I drew the trusty peacemaker what had belonged to my pa, Cherry Ray read aloud. She felt her eyes widen with excitement. Her heartbeat quickened with delicious anticipation. Rolling over onto her stomach, Cherry was barely conscious of the soft pasture grass beneath her as she continued to read. "You'll never take me alive, Arizona Bill," I hollered as a bullet whistled past my right ear. Knowing old Red would gallop straight and true, I turned in the saddle and took my aim. Squeezing my Colt trigger, I watched as Arizona Bill lurched back in the saddle. His pony slid to a stop, reared, and threw the outlaw to the ground. But my ma didn't raise a fool. I was alone, and Arizona Bill's gang rode hard and fast. If I didn't ride on, and I stayed to make certain Arizona Bill was dead, they'd sure as heck catch me. Cherry smiled as she paused to listen to a meadowlark whistle from a nearby pine tree. The Oklahoma Jenny dime novel in her hands was one of Cherry's true delights. She owned several Oklahoma Jennies, much to Mrs. Blakely's disapproval, but she guessed Oklahoma Jenny and Arizona Bill was just about her favorite Oklahoma Jenny adventure. Cherry continued reading. "Come on, old Red," I said to my pony. "Let's get on in to Green River before them outlaws find out we done in their boss." Old Red and I understood each other, and the minute I was settled right in the saddle, old Red bolted. We rode like the wind, old Red and me. No Arizona Bill or his gang would catch us that day, for Green River was only 5 miles yonder. Green River meant safety and good, loyal lawmen. Even for being pursued by Arizona and his gang, I couldn't keep my mind off Green River and its handsome sheriff. It'd been 3 weeks since I'd seen Sheriff Tate. I wondered if the bullet old Doc Whitfield dug out of Sheriff Tate's shoulder, the bullet Arizona Bill had put there with his Winchester. I wondered if that bullet was still in Sheriff Tate's pocket. I wondered if Sheriff Tate would wink at me the way he'd done so many times in the past. I wondered if he'd wink at me and say, "Hey there, Jenny. What might you think about marrying up with me?" I smiled and told old Red to get to a faster gallop. For Sheriff Tate, I would hang up my gun. Me, Oklahoma Jenny, I'd take to being his wife like fleas take to nipping a hound. Indeedy I would. Cherry Ray. It was Mrs. Blakely. It seemed like Mrs. Blakely was always hollering from the house for Cherry. Breathing a heavy sigh of disappointment, she closed her tattered copy of Oklahoma Jenny and Arizona Bill begrudgingly and raised herself from the fragrant pasture grasses. She placed the book inside a weathered tin box where she kept her Oklahoma Jennies. Closing the lid, she pushed the box into the hollow of a nearby tree. "Comin', Mrs. Blakely," Cherry called. "Hurry on up, Cherry. Your pa's fixin' to leave," Mrs. Blakely called. "I'm comin'," she shouted. Cherry tied her long brown hair up in a knot at the back of her head as she walked to where her pa was waiting with the wagon. "Here you go, girl," Arthur Ray said, handing a weathered hat to his daughter. Cherry climbed up onto the wagon seat beside him. Pulling the hat onto her head, she said, "Thanks, Pa." Adjusting the hat so it sat low enough to cover her eyebrows, Cherry returned her pa's loving smile. "That girl needs to be in skirts and petticoats, Arthur," Mrs. Blakely said, wagging a scolding index finger at the man. "Ain't no need for Cherry to be dragging any attention to herself in town these days, Fiona." Cherry smiled at her pa. Oh, she knew her pa had her dressing in men's blue jeans, boots, shirts, and hats in order to keep her from being noticed by the likes of Black Jack Haley and his outfit. Still, she liked to imagine her own pa was like Oklahoma Jenny's, allowing her to run as untamed and free as any wild Mustang. "She's a woman, Arthur," Mrs. Blakely reminded. Cherry sighed and rolled her eyes. Oh, she loved Mrs. Blakely well enough, and she was thankful her pa had found such a grandmotherly old woman to cook for the ranch hands and help with the house. White-haired, leathery, and as scrawny as any old polecat, Mrs. Blakely was a hard woman. Yet hard women were the ones that survived hard living. Cherry stared at Mrs. Blakely for a moment. Yep, she could well imagine Fiona Blakely shooting rabbits for supper while riding a barebacked pony.